All right, we're going to finish up our coverage of interest group politics by laying out the different categories of groups that you might put out there as a way to think about this topic in an analytically rigorous way. Let me give a warning, though, kind of a caveat emptor. There's a lot of different ways to classify groups of interest groups. There's no one way to do it. This is one way that our text uses. It's fine, but I've seen other classification schemes. Also true that these categories are not airtight. There's overlap. One group could fit two or three of these categories. So, these are some of the things to keep in mind as we walk through this material. Alrighty, economic interest groups. No matter which classification scheme you're looking at here, this is the one that all classification schemes use, right? Economic interest groups. Those are by far the dominant category of interest group. Makes sense, doesn't it, right? This is where financial issues are at stake in a big way. So yeah, you're going to find an insane proliferation of interest groups geared towards economic issues. Of course you are. Four different ones that we can look at here. One is agricultural interest groups, right, representing the economic interests of farmers, agribusinesses like Archer Daniels Midland, Nabisco, on and on. Right, so, and as our book points out quite nicely, there's a diversity of interests here within the broad agricultural sector, right? Because in some ways, right, the economic interests of farmers might be somewhat in tension with the economic interests of agribusinesses that purchase, right, raw materials from farmers, like crops and what have you, and then using magic, turn those ingredients into things like, I don't know, potato chips or Fritos or all the different things you can make from food products. A second form of economic interest group would be business interest groups. This is a very large and powerful category. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. You don't want to mess with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They represent the economic interests of America's largest corporations. Right. So they have a massive budget. We'll come back to that a little later. But again, like within the agricultural sector, a diversity of groups within this broad label of business interest groups, like the National Federation of Independent Businesses. They're going to tend to represent smaller businesses, not the big corporations that the U.S. Chamber represents. Another category here within economic interest groups would be labor. You got the big one here, of course, in Las Vegas, the Culinary Workers Union. You got the United Mine Workers. Presumably they represent mine workers up north here in Nevada. Yeah, and then lots of other labor groups, obviously. So, right, labor membership is, broadly speaking, in decline in America, has been for decades. But there's been some resurgence as service workers at places like Amazon and Starbucks start to get organized a little bit. So there are some growth sectors within the labor union movement here in America. It's been interesting. And then finally, you have professional groups, right, that represent professionals like university professors. You got the American Medical Association representing doctors, the American Bar Association representing attorneys, and so on and so forth. So those are four subcategories of the larger category of economic interest groups. All right, and then the other big category here would be non-economic interest groups. Basically, all those that are not economic groups, right, are non-economic interest groups by definition. And you've got quite a diverse grouping. You've got civil rights groups like the NAACP, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDA. You've got the Human Rights Campaign representing the LGBTQ community, right? All of those sorts of groups. You've got ideological groups, some that are quite liberal, right? Like the American Civil Liberties Union. They have a liberal take on the meaning of the Bill of Rights. You've got the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society. These are all conservative interest groups. Yeah, and just recognize, I mean, there are books and books and books written about each one of these categories that we're talking about here. So we're just brushing the surface. Public interest groups, kind of a broad, ambiguous label that I don't love myself, right? Because they're basically saying we represent what's good for the public. Right? I'm like, well, let me make my own judgment on what's good for the public, and let me decide if I think you really do represent what's good for the public. I mean, maybe I do. But maybe I don't. But that's a standard category, public interest groups representing the interests of the larger public. You got the public citizen group that represents consumers, kind of the Ralph Nader founded group. But then, right, like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is probably going to argue that a consumer interest group is not good for America, right? Because they represent a group that sometimes is in tension with a group like Nader's. And then you got environmental groups, another good example, right? Like the World Wildlife Fund, concerned about things like habitat for wildlife, global warming, that sort of thing. But again, many would say, a group like that is doing what's good for the public, but others would say, no, those are groups that are not necessarily representing what's good for the public. They're making a claim. I'm unpersuaded. So always keep that in mind about public interest groups. They're making a claim to represent what's good for the public. But then I think, right, we should decide for ourselves, is that a persuasive claim or not? Fourth, you've got what are known as single issue groups with a narrow target. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. I don't have any desire to sort of attach any pejorative meaning to that concept of single issue groups. I got no problem with single issue groups per se. They're like the National Rifle Association, right? Laser focused on the rights of firearm owners here in America. You got Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? They're specifically targeting drunk driving. So unlike some of these other groups that have kind of a broad umbrella of things that they're concerned about, these are groups that are laser focused on one particular issue. And then finally, you've got religious groups. I just glanced at some of the scholarship in this area. This is an exploding sort of category of interest groups. It's quite interesting. This is a growth sector for sure. You got groups like the Christian Coalition, the Southern Baptist Convention, Catholics Against Capital Punishment, right? A lot of them are going to be conservative. Others are going to be more middle of the road, and then some of them will even be a little bit to the left and more progressive. So quite a grouping there. And let me add in one more here, and that would be governmental interest groups. That's also a growth category, governmental interest groups. This is when, right, like Clark County here in Nevada might go up to Carson City every 2 years during that biennial legislative session, right, to advocate for the interests of Clark County in terms of legislation being considered up in Carson City, and more importantly, maybe in terms of the state budget. Because it turns out local governments get a lot of their budget from the state. So do they want representation up in Carson City every 2 years when that budget's being worked out? Oh, heck yes. And then you got states, right, are going to lobby the federal government. Because when the feds come up with their budget, right, every year, does Nevada have a skin in the game regarding how that budget breaks out for Nevada? Sure, right? So Nevada's going to lobby Congress, and I'm sure the executive branch, right, on things that they have a stake in, like the budget. Local governments will often lobby state governments. Does the city of Henderson lobby up in Carson City every 2 years during that legislative session? I'm sure they do. North Las Vegas, same dealio. City of Las Vegas, absolutely. All right, so don't disregard that other category of governmental interest groups. Government to government lobbying, it's a thing. And finally, to wrap this thing up on interest group politics. And here's the thing, as much time we were spending on this, I'm telling you, if you looked into the scholarship in political science on interest groups, it's vast. We're only skimming the surface. All right, so what are some of the resources that interest groups can mobilize for success? And this circles back, right, to a point that our authors make in that chapter on interest group politics. Some groups are more equal than others, right? Some are quite powerful and win regularly. Others are far weaker and only win very occasionally. So let's keep in mind, right, that critique of Madison's concept of pluralism leveled by E.E. Schachtschneider and Theodore Loewy, right? This grows out of that critique. Resources, money, right? Gosh, that's shocking. Money, right? Money matters here. The more money you have as an interest group, the more effective you can be as an interest group, right? You can donate more to congressional campaigns. You can sponsor conferences in places like Las Vegas or Paris or London or New York City, where you get to hobnob with high government officials and influence them. Just in all the ways, right? Money makes a difference in the world of interest group politics. Again, the big one here, the behemoth, it will be the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I believe they have the biggest budget of any interest group in American politics. Not surprising. So that makes them, right, more equal than others. Membership, right? Sheer numbers. If you can claim to represent 38 million people, like the AARP can indeed argue, right? Will that get you an audience with key members of Congress? 100%. Yes, it will. Right? The more people you can claim to represent, i.e., voters, right? The more you're going to get the attention of legislators, for example. Now that being said, it's not just a numbers game. Intensity of membership can also make a difference. The NRA is known, and rightly so, for having a passionate membership. So yeah, the NRA is a lot smaller than the AARP. They're still really big, by the way. This is no disrespect to the NRA. NRA is plenty big. They're like 6-7 million people. All right, but compared to the AARP, right, that's small. Well, that's crazy, but it's true. So the NRA, right, is a lot smaller than the AARP, but their members are a lot more engaged and intense about the issues that they care about, i.e. the rights of those who own firearms in America. So I would say, right, members of the AARP typically don't have passionate feelings about the AARP's policy focus on things like Medicare and Social Security, right? What they're passionate about are good deals on rental cars and hotel rooms. So that doesn't always translate for the AARP, right? There's a general lack of intensity there. NRA has intensity in spades. So that what the NRA lacks in sheer numbers, right, they make up for it with intensity. And then finally, effective leadership, right? Effective leadership. The quintessential example, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, right, head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, for many years. That made the SCLC, right, a group to be reckoned with, a charismatic, forceful leader. A counterexample, the NRA, as powerful as they have been, right now they're struggling a bit. I mean, do a little Google search on NRA leadership or NRA crises. You'll be a little shocked by what you find. They've had a failure of leadership. Wayne LaPierre, Oliver North, and I think maybe a few others, but those have been the two big ones. They were at each other's throats, the countering claims of corruption and a failure of leadership, and they're in legal trouble these days, they're in political trouble, they're in economic trouble. They've had a failure of leadership. I'm sure they'll get back on their feet, but they're not the force that they once were, and that's because of a failure of leadership. Leadership for a while now has been fragmented, divided, and corrupt. Super problematic. I'm sure they'll figure that out eventually.